What if every morning you woke up to find a single trail of footprints leading straight to your front door, footprints that appeared overnight without any sign of where they came from, and by the next night, everyone inside your house would simply vanish? No blood. No screams. No broken locks. Just empty homes, and those impossible footprints disappearing into the wilderness of Roan Mountain. Some people say they're the devil's footprints. Others believe they're something far older, something that has been walking these mountains long before humans ever arrived. Tonight's story is based on one of the strangest legends from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy true horror stories, forgotten legends, and terrifying mysteries inspired by real places across America. Now, let's begin. The tracks that shouldn't exist. The Appalachian Mountains had always possessed a strange way of swallowing sound. The wind moved differently there. Birds often stopped singing for reasons no one could explain. Even experienced hikers admitted that certain trails felt wrong, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. Roan Mountain was one of those places. Stretching across the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, the mountain was famous for its breathtaking balds, dense spruce forests, and endless layers of mist that rolled over the ridges like ghostly waves. Tourists admired the sunrises. Photographers chased autumn colors. Backpackers came searching for peace. Locals knew better. There were places on Roan Mountain where even the oldest hunters refused to go after sunset. Not because of bears. Not because of cliffs. Because of the footprints. Old people rarely spoke about them. When they did, their voices dropped into whispers. They called them the devil's footprints. Nobody knew how long the legend had existed. Some claimed it began before the Civil War. Others insisted native tribes had warned settlers about the walker centuries before the first cabins appeared on the mountain. The details changed from family to family. One thing never did. Every morning after certain winter nights, a trail of footprints appeared in fresh snow. Only one trail. Never two. Never the return path. They always began in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes they crossed frozen rivers without breaking the ice. Sometimes they climbed vertical cliffs where no human could possibly walk. Sometimes they crossed rooftops without leaving marks. And every trail ended at one single house. Always a different house. Always a different family. Then, the next night, someone inside disappeared. No bodies were ever found. No signs of struggle. Just empty beds, open front doors, and silence. Authorities dismissed the stories for generations. Wild animals. Runaways. Mountain accidents. Anything but the impossible. Eventually, people stopped reporting disappearances. Because reporting them changed nothing. Once the footprints chose your home, everyone believed your fate had already been decided. In the tiny mountain town of Elk Hollow, population barely 400, the legend had become little more than an uncomfortable bedtime story. Children dared each other to follow mysterious tracks into the woods. Teenagers laughed about Satan taking another vacation. Visitors bought postcards showing Roan Mountain covered in snow without realizing they stood only miles from places locals avoided entirely. Only the oldest residents still locked every window during winter. One of them was 78-year-old Eleanor Briggs. She had lived in Elk Hollow her entire life. Her father had vanished in 1953. Her grandfather in 1921. Neither had ever been found. She never spoke about them. Until journalist Ethan Carter arrived. Ethan wasn't interested in ghost stories. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. 34 years old, recently divorced, and desperate to revive his struggling career, Ethan worked for an online documentary channel covering forgotten American legends. His editor had laughed when assigning him Roan Mountain. Either you'll debunk another mountain myth, his boss said over the phone, or you'll get enough creepy footage for Halloween. Either way. Views. Ethan drove 12 hours from Virginia before reaching Elk Hollow. The town looked frozen in another century. Weathered wooden houses lined narrow roads. Church bells echoed through valleys. Old pickup trucks sat rusting beside barns. The mountains towered above everything like silent giants watching the valley below. Snow covered every rooftop. Clouds hung so low they almost touched the chimneys. His motel receptionist barely looked up. "You here for hiking?" "No." "Photography?" "No." She finally raised her eyes. You hear about the footprints? Ethan smiled. So people really talk about them? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly pushed an old paper map across the counter. Don't follow tracks after dark. I'm only making a documentary. That's what the last one said. Ethan frowned. There was another journalist? The receptionist stared at him for several uncomfortable seconds. I didn't say journalist. That night Ethan wandered through town interviewing whoever agreed to speak. Most refused. Some slammed doors. Others crossed themselves before walking away. Only one person finally invited him inside. Eleanor Briggs. Her home stood at the edge of town facing the forest. The old woman welcomed him with black coffee and a fireplace that barely warmed the room. Every wall displayed faded family photographs. Dozens of faces. Many with black ribbons tied around their frames. You think this is folklore, Eleanor said. I think legends usually start somewhere. They do. And where did this one begin? She looked toward the dark window. No one knows. Then how do you know it's real? Instead of answering, Eleanor stood and disappeared into another room. She returned carrying a weathered leather journal. The cover looked nearly 2 centuries old. My great-grandmother kept records. Ethan carefully opened the first page. Every entry listed a date. A family name. One sentence. Tracks ended at the Miller house. Entire family gone by sunrise. No signs of struggle. Page after page. Decade after decade. Names repeated. Disappearances accumulated. More than 200 entries. The handwriting changed over generations, but the pattern never did. Ethan's skepticism slowly faded. Who wrote these? My family. Why? So someone would remember. He continued flipping pages. The final entry stopped him cold. It had been written only 6 months earlier. Footprints stopped at the Harris cabin. Mother. Father. 2 daughters. Gone. Police investigated? They always investigate. And? They never stay long. Ethan spent nearly 4 hours recording Eleanor's testimony. When he finally prepared to leave, she grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. If snow falls tonight? Yes? Don't look outside before sunrise. He laughed awkwardly. You really believe seeing them matters? No. She whispered. I believe being seen matters. Heavy snow began around midnight. Huge flakes drifted silently across Elk Hollow. Streetlights disappeared behind white curtains. Wind moaned through pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, something echoed. Not a wolf. Not an owl. Almost. Footsteps. Slow. Crunch. 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 As if someone walked deliberately through fresh snow outside every house in town. Ethan woke shortly after dawn. The town felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. No vehicles. No barking dogs. No children waiting for school buses. Only silence. He remembered Eleanor's warning. Curiosity won. He pulled aside the motel curtain. Outside, perfectly preserved in untouched snow, a single line of enormous footprints stretched across the empty road. Each print looked almost human. Except for one impossible detail. Every footprint had only 3 long toes. The impressions were far deeper than any person's weight could have made. They continued past parked cars. Past fences. Across rooftops. Without interruption. Ethan grabbed his camera. Heart racing. He rushed outside. The cold air hit him like ice water. People had already gathered at a distance. Nobody stepped closer. Nobody spoke. Everyone simply stared. The footprints crossed the center of town. Then disappeared behind a row of houses. Toward one destination. A small white farmhouse belonging to the Harper family. A young couple. 1 little boy. A grandmother. 4 people. Standing on their porch. Looking down at the tracks leading directly to their front door. No one dared approach them. Because every person in Elk Hollow already knew. Someone had been chosen. And when the sun finally disappeared behind Roan Mountain that evening, no one, not even the sheriff, was willing to stay inside the Harper house after dark. The Harper family stood frozen on their porch, their faces drained of color as they stared at the impossible trail ending at their front door. Their young son, no older than 8, clung tightly to his mother's hand, too frightened to ask why the entire town had gathered at the edge of their property without saying a word. His grandmother quietly whispered a prayer beneath her breath, her trembling fingers wrapped around an old wooden cross that had belonged to her own mother. Sheriff Daniel Brooks eventually stepped forward, though even he hesitated before crossing the invisible boundary where the footprints began. He had served Elk Hollow for nearly 20 years, but he had never investigated one of the infamous Devil's footprints himself. Every previous incident had occurred while he was away or before he had taken office, leaving him to believe the stories were nothing more than mountain folklore. Now, standing before the enormous three-toed impressions pressed deep into the snow, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Ethan Carter filmed every second with shaking hands, zooming in on each footprint. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Each impression measured nearly 18 inches long, with 3 narrow toes ending in razor-sharp points, as though whatever had created them possessed claws instead of nails. Even more disturbing was the depth. The snow beneath each print had been crushed almost a foot into the frozen ground, suggesting that whatever had walked there weighed several hundred pounds. Yet the stride between each footprint remained perfectly even, almost elegant, as though the creature had glided effortlessly across the mountain. There were no drag marks, no slipping, and no signs of hesitation. The tracks simply appeared from the forest, crossed fences, ignored walls, and ended precisely at the Harper family's front steps. Curiosity finally overcame fear as Sheriff Brooks knelt beside one of the footprints. He reached out cautiously, intending to measure it with a ruler from his pocket. The instant the metal touched the frozen impression, a loud cracking sound echoed beneath his boots. He jerked backward, convinced the ice beneath him was breaking, but the ground remained solid. Instead, the footprint itself released a faint plume of black vapor that drifted silently into the cold morning air before vanishing. Every person watching gasped simultaneously. The sheriff quickly stood and backed away, refusing to touch the tracks again. His face had turned ghostly pale, and for several long moments he could not find the words to explain what everyone had just witnessed. By midday the entire town had descended upon the Harper property. Some brought food, believing the family should not be left alone. Others arrived carrying rifles, axes, and hunting knives, determined to protect their neighbors if the legend proved true. Pastor William Hayes stood near the front porch reading verses from the Bible while several elderly women joined hands in prayer. Despite their efforts, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over everyone present. It was as though the mountain itself had grown unnaturally silent. The wind that normally swept through Roan Mountain had disappeared completely. Even the crows that usually circled above the valley were nowhere to be seen. The only sound came from the slow creaking of snow-covered trees bending beneath their icy burden. Eleanor Briggs arrived shortly after noon, leaning heavily on her walking cane. The crowd parted without anyone asking them to move. Although many considered her little more than an old woman clinging to outdated superstitions, no one questioned her authority whenever the footprints appeared. She studied the trail for nearly a minute before closing her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the whispering wind. "They're closer this time." Ethan turned his camera toward her immediately. "Closer than what?" he asked. Eleanor opened her eyes but kept staring at the forest. "Closer than they have ever been before. The walker used to choose homes on the edge of town. Now it walks through the center. It isn't hunting people anymore." Ethan frowned. "Then what's it hunting?" Eleanor slowly looked toward the Harper family's frightened child standing in the doorway. "It's searching for someone." A murmur spread through the crowd. No one had ever heard the legend described that way before. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Who is the walker?" Eleanor hesitated, as though speaking the name aloud carried its own danger. Long before settlers built cabins here, the Cherokee told stories about a spirit that wandered the mountains after every heavy snowfall. They said it had no face because it borrowed the faces of those it took. It never ran. It never chased. It simply walked until it reached the person it wanted. Once it found them, the mountain itself would erase every trace they had ever existed. Ethan noticed several older residents quietly nodding in agreement. None of them appeared surprised by Eleanor's words. Instead, they looked terrified that she had spoken them aloud. As daylight slowly faded behind the towering peaks of Roan Mountain, Sheriff Brooks organized volunteers into rotating shifts. for armed men would remain outside the Harper house throughout the night while another 6 patrolled the nearby roads. Floodlights powered by portable generators illuminated every side of the property, casting long white beams across the snow-covered yard. Additional vehicles formed a circle around the farmhouse, their headlights left on to eliminate every shadow. Ethan couldn't help but admire the determination of the townspeople. They were preparing for a siege against an enemy none of them had ever seen. Inside the Harper house, however, the atmosphere felt entirely different. Emily Harper sat beside the fireplace holding her son tightly in her arms while her husband, Jacob, repeatedly checked every window and locked every door. His shotgun rested across his lap, loaded with fresh shells despite the fact that no one could explain what kind of creature they might face. Ethan interviewed them carefully, noticing how Jacob struggled to maintain his composure. "I don't believe in monsters," Jacob insisted, though his trembling voice betrayed his confidence. "If somebody's playing a sick joke, they'll regret coming here tonight." Emily remained silent. Her eyes never left the dark window behind Ethan, as though she expected someone, or something, to appear at any moment. Just after sunset, an icy fog began rolling down from Roan Mountain far earlier than usual. Within minutes it swallowed the surrounding forest, creeping silently between trees before spilling across the open fields like ghostly water. The floodlights still pierced the darkness, but their beams grew weaker as the fog thickened. Shapes appeared and disappeared within the mist, causing the armed volunteers outside to raise their weapons repeatedly at nothing. Radio communications between patrols became distorted by bursts of static, and several officers reported hearing slow footsteps crunching through the snow somewhere beyond the lights. Each time they investigated, they found nothing. Then, at exactly 9:17 p.m., every light surrounding the Harper farmhouse flickered simultaneously. The generators continued running. The engines never stopped. Yet the lights dimmed as though something unseen had passed directly in front of them. The radios fell silent. The wind died. And from somewhere deep within the white fog covering Roan Mountain, came the unmistakable sound of a single, heavy footstep. The sound echoed through the valley with unnatural clarity. Crunch. One slow, deliberate footstep, as though something impossibly heavy had just planted its foot into the fresh snow beyond the wall of fog. Every volunteer outside the Harper farmhouse immediately turned toward the forest. Rifles were raised. Flashlights swept across the thick white mist, but their beams reached only a few yards before being swallowed whole. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then came another step. Crunch. It was closer this time. Sheriff Brooks gripped his shotgun so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Who's out there?" he shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed briefly against the mountains before being consumed by silence. No answer came, only another slow footstep, measured and patient, as though whatever approached had no fear of being discovered. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Ethan stood beside the living room window with his camera pointed toward the front yard, recording through the glass despite the condensation fogging the lens. Emily Harper held her son tightly against her chest while Jacob stood between his family and the front door, refusing to take his eyes off the porch. Even the fire in the stone fireplace seemed weaker than before, its flames shrinking despite the fresh logs burning within. The air inside the house suddenly became bitterly cold. Ethan could see his own breath drifting in front of his face. The old grandfather clock in the corner, which had ticked steadily all evening, stopped without warning. Its pendulum froze in mid-swing at exactly 9:19 p.m. Outside, Deputy Marcus Hill slowly stepped away from the patrol line, unable to ignore the strange noise coming from the fog. "I think I see someone," he whispered into his radio. Static answered him. He adjusted the volume, but every channel had gone dead. The only sound coming through the speaker was a faint rhythmic breathing that did not belong to anyone on the police frequency. Swallowing his fear, Marcus aimed his flashlight toward a cluster of pine trees. For a brief second, the beam illuminated what looked like a tall human silhouette standing perfectly still between the trunks. It appeared impossibly thin, nearly 8 feet tall, with arms hanging unnaturally low beside its body. Before Marcus could focus on its features, the fog shifted, and the figure vanished as though it had never existed. "Did you see that?" Marcus shouted. The other deputies rushed toward him, but when they reached the spot, they found only untouched snow. There were no footprints. No broken branches. Nothing that suggested anyone had been standing there moments earlier. Sheriff Brooks frowned. "Stay together," he ordered. "Nobody leaves the lights." Yet as he finished speaking, another volunteer called from the opposite side of the property. "The footprints." Everyone spun around. A fresh line of enormous three-toed footprints had begun appearing in the snow. Not from the forest. Not from the road. They were materializing one by one in the middle of the Harper family's front yard. There was no creature making them. No visible body. Each print simply pressed itself into the snow with an audible crunch, as though an invisible giant was walking across the property. The volunteers watched in absolute horror as another footprint formed, then another, each one slightly closer to the front porch. Snow compressed downward by nearly a foot before settling into the unmistakable shape of those monstrous three-toed tracks. Ethan rushed outside, unable to believe what he was witnessing. His camera captured every impossible second. Through the viewfinder, he watched the empty space between two fresh footprints shimmer faintly, as though the air itself bent around something massive that could not be seen. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he remained frozen behind the camera. Eleanor Briggs slowly stepped onto the porch despite everyone's desperate attempts to stop her. Her weathered eyes followed the invisible path with terrifying certainty. "Don't look between the footprints," she said quietly. "It doesn't like to be seen." Ethan lowered the camera for only a moment. "What do you mean?" Eleanor never looked at him. "Your eyes will try to understand what isn't meant for them." Before Ethan could ask another question, one of the volunteers ignored her warning. A young hunter named Caleb Mason narrowed his eyes and stared directly at the empty space between the newest footprints. At first, nothing happened. Then Caleb's expression changed completely. His face drained of all color. His pupils widened until almost no iris remained. His rifle slipped from his hands. "Oh, God," he whispered. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he continued staring into the invisible darkness. "Its face?" he murmured, barely audible. Why does it have my face?" Without another word, Caleb turned and sprinted toward the forest. The deputies shouted after him, but he never slowed down. Within seconds, the thick fog swallowed him completely. The volunteers chased after him with flashlights and weapons drawn, yet the mountain seemed to consume every sound they made. They searched for nearly 10 minutes, calling Caleb's name over and over, but all they found was his flashlight lying upright in the snow, still shining toward the sky. Around it stretched a single line of enormous three-toed footprints leading deeper into the forest. There were no human footprints leaving the flashlight. There were no signs of a struggle. Only the devil's tracks, continuing into the darkness beneath the towering pines, where something unseen had begun walking long before anyone in Elk Hollow had ever heard its name. For several seconds, no one moved. The search party stood at the edge of the forest, their flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the suffocating fog, each beam dissolving into white emptiness after only a few yards. Sheriff Brooks could hear the frightened breathing of his deputies, but beyond that, the mountain had fallen into an impossible silence. Even the wind had vanished. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. Ethan slowly lowered his camera and replayed the footage he had just recorded. The footprints had indeed formed by themselves, one after another, but as he watched the video frame by frame, he noticed something that had escaped his eyes in real time. Between every new footprint, for less than a fraction of a second, the image distorted. The pixels twisted into a tall shadow that the camera had somehow captured, although no one had seen it standing there. Ethan froze the frame and enlarged it. The silhouette was barely visible, but it appeared impossibly thin, with unnaturally long limbs and a head tilted sharply to one side. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness. "Show me," Sheriff Brooks demanded. Ethan handed him the camera without speaking. The sheriff stared at the frozen frame for nearly a minute before quietly returning it. His face had become pale once again. "Don't let anyone else see this," he whispered. "If the town realizes there's actually something in those tracks, they'll panic." Ethan nodded, though he knew the panic had already begun. The volunteers were whispering among themselves, glancing nervously toward the woods. Some wanted to continue searching for Caleb Mason, while others insisted they should return to the Harper house before something else emerged from the fog. Nobody noticed Eleanor Briggs standing perfectly still near the porch, her eyes fixed on the forest as though she were listening to voices no one else could hear. Suddenly, Eleanor spoke in a calm but trembling voice. "He's still alive." Everyone turned toward her. Sheriff Brooks frowned. "Caleb?" Eleanor slowly nodded. "For now." Ethan stepped closer. "How do you know?" The old woman closed her eyes. "Because the walker doesn't kill immediately." Her words sent a chill through everyone standing nearby. "It lets them walk first." No one understood what she meant, and before anyone could ask another question, Eleanor pointed her cane toward the dark forest. "Listen." At first, Ethan heard nothing. Then, faintly, somewhere deep among the towering pines, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were not the heavy, deliberate crunches that had echoed earlier. These were human footsteps, fast, uneven, and desperate. A man's voice suddenly pierced the silence. "Help!" It was Caleb. The cry echoed through the valley before being swallowed by the fog. "Help me!" Without hesitation, Sheriff Brooks and 3 deputies rushed toward the sound, their flashlights bouncing wildly through the trees. Ethan followed with his camera despite every instinct telling him to stay behind. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the stranger everything became. Snow covered the ground, yet their own footprints disappeared only moments after they made them, as though the mountain refused to remember where they had walked. The towering spruce trees seemed taller than before, their branches knitting together overhead until almost no moonlight penetrated the canopy. Every direction looked exactly the same. Ethan glanced back, expecting to see the distant lights of the Harper farmhouse, but they had vanished completely. It was as though the forest had closed behind them. Caleb cried out again, much closer this time. "Over here!" Sheriff Brooks ran toward the voice until his flashlight illuminated a small clearing. There, kneeling in the snow, was Caleb Mason. He was shaking violently, his clothes soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His rifle was gone, and both of his hands were covered in blood. Ethan hurried forward, relieved to see him alive. "Caleb," he shouted. "What happened?" Caleb slowly lifted his head. His expression was one Ethan would never forget. His eyes were wide open, but they seemed unable to focus on anything. Tears streamed continuously down his face, and his lips trembled uncontrollably. "It followed me," he whispered. "I kept running, but it never chased." Sheriff Brooks knelt beside him. "Who followed you?" Caleb's breathing became erratic. "I could hear it behind me, one step, every time I took 3. He swallowed hard, staring into the darkness beyond the clearing. "No matter how fast I ran, it stayed the same distance away." Ethan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Caleb continued speaking, his voice barely audible. "I finally stopped, because I couldn't breathe anymore." He looked directly at Ethan. "That's when I realized." His entire body began to shake violently. The footsteps weren't behind me anymore. No one spoke. Caleb slowly raised one trembling finger. He pointed toward the enormous pine tree standing only a few feet behind Ethan. Ethan turned. At first, he saw nothing except rough bark covered in patches of snow. Then his flashlight beam shifted slightly. Carved into the trunk, far higher than any person could reach, were hundreds of human faces. Not sculptures. Not drawings. Actual faces, frozen within the wood as though the tree had grown around them. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes filled with terror. Some appeared ancient, their features nearly consumed by bark. Others looked disturbingly fresh. One face still had strands of brown hair trapped beneath the wood. Caleb let out a terrified sob. "I heard them talking." Ethan stepped closer despite every instinct urging him to run. As the flashlight swept across the twisted trunk, a faint whisper drifted through the clearing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an echo. It sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once, so quietly that the words blended together into an incomprehensible murmur. Ethan leaned in, straining to understand. Then one voice suddenly became clear. Soft. Familiar. It sounded exactly like his younger sister, who had died in a car accident 12 years earlier. Ethan. His blood turned to ice. No one in Elk Hollow knew about his sister. No one could have imitated her voice. Yet the whisper came again, gentle and pleading. Ethan, don't leave me here. He took one involuntary step toward the tree. Then another. Behind him, Eleanor Briggs' warning echoed in his memory. The walker doesn't hunt people anymore. It's searching for someone. And for the very first time since arriving in Elk Hollow, Ethan realized with growing horror that the devil's footprints might never have been leading him to the Harper family at all. They may have been leading him to the mountain. Ethan's legs moved almost on their own. The whisper carried the warmth of a memory he had spent years trying to bury, sounding exactly as his younger sister had on the last morning he had seen her alive. Every instinct told him it was impossible, yet the voice reached into the deepest corners of his grief with terrifying precision. Ethan. It called again, softer this time. I'm cold, please help me. He took another step toward the massive pine tree, barely aware of Sheriff Brooks shouting his name somewhere behind him. The faces trapped within the bark seemed to shift ever so slightly, their hollow eyes following his movement. Some looked desperate. Others appeared resigned, as though they had been waiting for centuries for someone else to join them. Before Ethan could touch the tree, a powerful hand grabbed the back of his jacket and pulled him backward. He stumbled into Sheriff Brooks, who forced him several steps away from the trunk. Don't listen to it, the sheriff barked. Ethan blinked several times, as though waking from a dream. The whisper vanished instantly, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. He looked back at the tree and felt his stomach tighten. The faces were still there, but now every mouth was closed. They no longer appeared to be screaming. Instead, they seemed to be smiling. Caleb Mason suddenly let out a terrified gasp. His trembling finger remained pointed toward the tree, but his expression changed from horror to complete disbelief. It moved, he whispered. Ethan and the deputies immediately aimed their flashlights higher into the branches. At first they saw nothing unusual. Then, nearly 40 feet above the ground, something shifted behind the thick curtain of pine needles. It was only a silhouette, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, standing perfectly balanced on a branch that should never have supported its weight. The figure remained absolutely motionless. It had no visible face, no recognizable features, only a shape darker than the surrounding darkness. Yet every person in the clearing felt the unmistakable sensation that it was staring directly at them. One deputy instinctively raised his rifle. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure did not respond. Instead, it slowly tilted its head to one side in an almost curious manner, like an animal studying unfamiliar prey. Then, without warning, every flashlight flickered simultaneously. Darkness swallowed the clearing for less than 2 seconds. When the beams returned, the branch was empty. The deputies spun in every direction, searching frantically. "Where did it go?" one of them shouted. Nobody answered. Ethan's breathing became shallow as he scanned the surrounding trees with his camera. The forest suddenly felt impossibly crowded, though he could see no one. Every instinct screamed that something was circling them just beyond the reach of their lights. Then came the sound. Crunch. One heavy footstep. Much closer than before. It came from directly behind them. The entire group turned at once, their flashlights illuminating a fresh three-toed footprint pressed deeply into the untouched snow. There had been nothing there only seconds earlier. Another step echoed through the clearing. Crunch. A second footprint appeared roughly 10 feet closer. No body. No shadow. Only the impossible impression forming before their eyes. Panic spread through the group. One deputy fired a warning shot into the darkness. The rifle's report thundered across the valley, scattering snow from the surrounding branches. For a brief moment, everyone expected an attack. Instead, the echo rolled through the mountains and slowly died away. Then something answered. Not from one direction. From every direction. The same gunshot echoed back, but twisted. The sound became distorted, lower, almost like laughter hidden inside the mountains themselves. The deputies stared at one another in stunned silence. Ethan's camera microphone captured the strange echo perfectly. As he listened through his headphones, he realized there was another sound buried beneath it. Voices. Hundreds of whispering voices repeating the same sentence over and over. Keep walking. Keep walking. Keep walking. Caleb covered his ears and screamed. Make them stop, he cried, collapsing to his knees. Blood trickled from his nose as the whispers grew louder. Ethan removed one headphone, expecting the voices to disappear, but they continued even without the recording. The sound wasn't coming from the camera. It was coming from the forest itself. Sheriff Brooks made his decision immediately. We're leaving, he ordered. Now. 2 deputies lifted Caleb to his feet while the others formed a defensive circle around the group. Nobody argued. They began moving quickly through the trees, following what they believed was the path back to the Harper farmhouse. Yet after nearly 15 minutes of walking, Ethan noticed something that froze him in place. The enormous pine tree stood directly ahead of them once again. The same carved faces. The same twisted trunk. The same unnatural silence. They had been walking in a straight line the entire time. Yet somehow, the mountain had brought them back to exactly where they had started. Eleanor Briggs slowly stepped forward, her expression grim but strangely unsurprised. She looked at the sheriff and spoke the words her grandfather had once written in his journal nearly a century earlier. It has closed the path. Sheriff Brooks frowned. What does that mean? Eleanor's tired eyes never left the darkness between the trees. It means, she whispered, the walker has decided that no one leaves Roan Mountain until it chooses who belongs to it. Far beyond the clearing, hidden somewhere in the endless sea of black pines, another slow, deliberate footstep echoed through the frozen wilderness. Crunch. This time, it was followed by a second set of footsteps. Human footsteps. Walking beside it. No one dared breathe as the second set of footsteps continued through the darkness. Unlike the heavy, deliberate crunch of the unseen walker, these were unmistakably human, uneven, hesitant, and exhausted. They sounded as though someone had been wandering through the forest for hours, barely able to lift one foot after the other. Sheriff Brooks motioned for everyone to kill their flashlights. One by one, the beams disappeared until the clearing was swallowed by darkness. Only the pale moonlight filtering through the branches offered enough illumination to distinguish the outlines of the trees. The footsteps grew louder. Every member of the search party tightened their grip on their weapons, waiting for the figure to emerge. Out of the fog stepped a man wearing a faded red flannel jacket. His clothes were torn, his beard was overgrown, and his boots looked as though they had been walking for months. His skin had the sickly gray color of someone who had not seen sunlight in years. He moved slowly, staring at the ground as if he could not remember how to lift his head. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when Caleb whispered, "That's impossible." Sheriff Brooks narrowed his eyes, struggling to recognize the stranger. Then Eleanor Briggs gasped quietly. Thomas Harris. The name spread through the group like an electric shock. 6 months earlier, the entire Harris family had vanished after the Devil's footprints ended at their cabin. Search teams had combed every inch of Roan Mountain for weeks without finding a single trace. The state police had eventually declared them missing, presumed dead. Yet Thomas Harris was standing only 20 yards away, walking out of the fog as though he had simply gotten lost in the woods. Ethan stepped forward carefully. "Thomas," he called. The man did not answer. He continued walking with slow, mechanical steps, never once looking at anyone around him. As Thomas entered the clearing, everyone noticed something deeply unsettling. Fresh snow clung to his boots, but he left no footprints behind him. Every place his feet touched remained perfectly smooth, untouched by his weight. Ethan quickly aimed his camera downward to confirm what he was seeing. The lens captured Thomas's boots making contact with the snow, yet no impressions formed beneath them. It was as if he no longer belonged to the physical world. Sheriff Brooks cautiously approached him. "Thomas, can you hear me?" Still no response. The missing man's lips moved slightly, repeating something under his breath. Ethan strained to listen. Still walking. The words were barely audible. "Don't stop." Thomas repeated the phrase again and again with the empty rhythm of someone trapped inside a nightmare. Suddenly, he stopped. For the first time since emerging from the fog, he slowly lifted his head. His eyes were completely white. There were no pupils. No irises. Only two pale, lifeless spheres reflecting the moonlight. Emily Harper's husband, Jacob, staggered backward in terror. Caleb covered his mouth to keep from screaming. Ethan instinctively took another step back, but Thomas was not looking at any of them. His blank eyes remained fixed on something standing behind the group. Everyone turned at once. The clearing was empty. Or at least it appeared to be. Then the temperature dropped so violently that frost spread across Ethan's camera lens in seconds. A strange pressure settled over the clearing, making it difficult to breathe. The pine branches overhead bent downward despite the complete absence of wind. Somewhere beyond the edge of the trees came the familiar sound. Crunch. A fresh three-toed footprint appeared at the edge of the clearing. Then another. And another. They formed a slow circle around everyone present. The walker was no longer approaching. It was surrounding them. Sheriff Brooks realized it at the same moment Eleanor did. "Stay together," he shouted. "Nobody breaks the circle." The deputies formed a defensive ring, pointing their rifles outward. Ethan kept filming despite his trembling hands. Through the camera's viewfinder, the empty spaces between the new footprints shimmered once again. This time the distortion was stronger, almost resembling the outline of a towering body wrapped in darkness. Whenever he looked away from the screen, he saw nothing. But through the camera, something enormous was moving around them in slow, silent steps. Thomas Harris suddenly smiled. It was not a smile of relief. It was the expression of someone finally recognizing an old friend. In a calm, emotionless voice, he whispered, "It says, there's another one." Ethan frowned. "Another what?" Thomas's smile widened unnaturally. "Another door." Before anyone could react, Thomas raised one trembling arm and pointed directly at Ethan. Not at his face. At the leather journal sticking out of Ethan's backpack, the journal Eleanor had loaned him only hours earlier. Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. "The journal," she whispered. Ethan quickly pulled it from his bag. The weathered leather cover felt strangely warm despite the freezing air. As he opened it, he realized something impossible. There were new pages. Pages that had not been there before. Fresh ink still glistened on the paper as though the words had been written only moments ago. The final entry read, "August 14th. The walker has chosen another keeper. His name is Ethan Carter." Below the sentence, still wet with black ink, a second line began writing itself. No hand held the pen. No one touched the page. The letters slowly appeared on their own. "He must reach the church before sunrise, or the mountain will keep them all." The last word finished forming. The ink stopped moving. And somewhere deep within the endless darkness of Roan Mountain, a church bell rang. Once. Though everyone in Elk Hollow knew there had not been a church on that mountain for more than 100 years. The lonely toll of the church bell rolled through the mountains with a haunting resonance that seemed to vibrate beneath the earth itself. Every member of the search party fell silent, instinctively counting the echoes as they faded into the endless forest. No one spoke until the final reverberation disappeared. Sheriff Brooks slowly turned toward Eleanor Briggs, whose face had become almost as pale as the snow beneath her feet. For the first time that night, genuine fear replaced the quiet certainty she had carried since the footprints first appeared. She gripped her cane so tightly her knuckles whitened. "The bell hasn't rung in 83 years, she whispered. "Not since St. Ashcroft Church burned to the ground." Ethan looked up from the journal, confusion filling his expression. "You said there hasn't been a church on this mountain for a century." Eleanor nodded slowly. "There isn't, at least not one that the living can find." A heavy silence settled over the clearing as everyone tried to comprehend what she meant. Ethan carefully folded the journal shut, but even through the leather cover he could feel an unnatural warmth pulsing from its pages, almost like a heartbeat. Every few seconds the book trembled slightly in his hands. Sheriff Brooks noticed it immediately. "Is it still writing?" Ethan hesitated before opening the journal again. The fresh ink had dried, but beneath the last sentence another faint line was beginning to emerge, each letter slowly bleeding through the paper without the touch of a pen. It was too incomplete to read, yet one word stood out clearly. "Confess." The word disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan stared at the page in disbelief. "What does it want me to confess?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Thomas Harris, who remained standing motionless at the edge of the clearing with the same empty smile frozen across his face. "The mountain never chooses people at random," she said quietly. "It chooses burdens. Guilt. Regret. Promises that were broken." She turned to Ethan. "Whatever happened in your life before you came here, it already knows." Those words struck Ethan harder than he cared to admit. Images he had spent years trying to forget flashed through his mind: his younger sister begging him to stay home the day of the accident, the unanswered phone call he had ignored because he was too busy chasing another story, the crushing guilt that had followed him ever since. He had never spoken about it publicly. Even his editor knew only fragments of the truth. Yet somehow the mountain had whispered with her voice. It hadn't guessed. It knew. Before anyone could continue the conversation, Thomas Harris suddenly lifted his head toward the darkness beyond the trees. The unnatural smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of absolute terror. His lips parted slowly as though he wanted to scream, but no sound emerged. Then, in a voice that was unmistakably his own for the first time, he whispered, "It's coming." The forest answered immediately. Every pine tree surrounding the clearing began to creak at once. Not from the wind. From pressure. The towering trunks leaned inward by only a few inches, but it was enough to make the entire forest seem alive. Snow cascaded from the branches in thick white curtains as deep cracks echoed through the woods. Ethan swept his flashlight across the tree line and froze. Between the trunks stood dozens of figures. At first he thought they were more trees. Then one of them moved. A man. A woman. An elderly couple. A young girl holding a ragged teddy bear. More figures slowly emerged from the fog until nearly 30 silent silhouettes stood watching the clearing. Their clothing came from different decades: old farming overalls, Civil War coats, faded dresses from the 1940s, hiking gear from recent years. Some appeared almost transparent beneath the moonlight, while others looked unnervingly solid. None of them spoke. None of them blinked. Eleanor's voice trembled. "The missing." Sheriff Brooks lowered his shotgun in disbelief. Every face reflected an old missing person photograph that had hung in the sheriff's office at one time or another. Some had vanished only months ago. Others had disappeared generations before Brooks was even born. They stood shoulder to shoulder among the trees, staring silently at the living with expressions that carried neither anger nor relief, only exhaustion. One small figure slowly stepped forward. It was a little girl no older than 7. She wore a faded blue coat dusted with snow and held a cracked porcelain doll against her chest. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Mary Whitlock. The name escaped her lips before she realized she had spoken aloud. Mary Whitlock had disappeared in the winter of 1968 while walking home from school. Hundreds of volunteers had searched Roan Mountain for nearly 2 weeks without finding so much as a single footprint. Now she stood less than 20 feet away. The little girl looked directly at Eleanor. Then she smiled sadly. Without speaking, she raised one small hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Immediately, every other silent figure did exactly the same. 30 missing souls? All pointing toward the same destination. Far beyond the trees. Toward the place where the unseen church bell had rung. Thomas Harris slowly began walking in that direction, his movements stiff but determined. One by one, the other silent figures turned and followed him into the darkness without leaving a single footprint behind. Within moments, they were swallowed by the fog. Only Mary remained. She looked back at Ethan one final time. Softly, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "You still have time." Then she faded into the mist like morning breath in winter air. The clearing fell silent once more. No ghosts. No whispers. Only the cold mountain and the distant outline of an ancient stone pathway that none of them had noticed before. Moments earlier, there had been nothing but untouched snow. Now a narrow trail of weathered stones stretched through the forest, disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor stared at it with haunted eyes. "I've lived on this mountain for 78 years, she murmured. "I have never seen that path before." Sheriff Brooks tightened his grip on his shotgun and looked toward Ethan. "If that road leads to the church," he said quietly, "then that's where we're going." As if acknowledging their decision, the unseen church bell rang again. This time. Twice. And somewhere far ahead, hidden within the black heart of Roan Mountain, a pair of massive three-toed footprints slowly pressed themselves into the snow, waiting at the beginning of the forgotten path. For nearly a minute, no one stepped onto the newly revealed stone path. It cut through the forest in a perfectly straight line, its weathered slabs emerging from beneath the snow as though they had been waiting for centuries to be uncovered. Thick moss clung to the edges of the ancient stones despite the freezing temperature, and faded symbols had been carved into their surfaces, worn almost smooth by time. Ethan knelt beside the first marker, brushing away a thin layer of frost with his glove. The carving resembled a circle crossed by 3 long claw-like marks, the same shape as the mysterious footprints that had haunted Elk Hollow for generations. Eleanor looked over his shoulder and slowly shook her head. "Those aren't decorations," she whispered. "They're warnings." Sheriff Brooks ordered everyone to check their equipment before moving forward. 2 deputies discovered that their radios had completely stopped functioning. Fresh batteries made no difference. The screens remained black, as if every electronic device had died the moment the path appeared. Ethan reached for his phone out of habit, but there was no signal, no GPS, not even a clock. The battery icon flickered wildly before freezing at exactly 33%. He glanced at his camera, relieved to see it still recording, yet something was wrong. According to the timecode, it was still 9:19 p.m., the exact moment the grandfather clock inside the Harper house had stopped. Nearly an hour had passed, but the recording time had never advanced. Ethan frowned. "Time isn't moving," he muttered. Eleanor overheard him and quietly replied, "It is. Just not the way it does outside these woods." With no better option, the group stepped onto the forgotten trail. The instant Ethan's boot touched the first stone, a strange vibration traveled through the ground beneath him. It was so subtle that he almost believed he had imagined it, until everyone else paused at exactly the same moment. The mountain seemed to exhale. Somewhere high above the treetops, a flock of unseen birds suddenly took flight, their wings beating frantically through the darkness before disappearing into the fog. Then the forest returned to silence. The deeper they followed the path, the older the mountain appeared. Towering oaks gave way to enormous hemlocks whose trunks were so wide that 3 people could not have wrapped their arms around them. Many of the trees bore deep scars, not from lightning or axes, but from 3 long grooves carved vertically into the bark, as though some enormous claw had passed through the forest centuries earlier. None of the wounds had healed. Black sap oozed slowly from the ancient cuts, dripping silently onto the stones below. Caleb, still pale from his ordeal, refused to look at the trees. Every few steps he glanced nervously over his shoulder, convinced something was following them. Ethan noticed another unsettling detail. The forest no longer contained any ordinary sounds. There were no insects, no owls, no rustling animals hidden beneath the underbrush. Even their own footsteps seemed strangely muted, absorbed by the mountain before echoes could form. Instead, another sound gradually replaced them. It was almost too faint to recognize at first, a distant choir singing somewhere ahead. The voices drifted through the fog without words, carrying a melody that felt impossibly old. It was neither joyful nor mournful, but hauntingly beautiful, like a forgotten hymn echoing across generations. Every member of the group heard it. No one dared mention it aloud. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, the path reached the edge of a steep ravine. An ancient stone bridge arched across the darkness, its surface cracked and overgrown with moss. Massive statues stood at each end of the bridge, half hidden beneath vines and snow. Time had eroded their faces beyond recognition, but each figure possessed the same disturbing feature, 3 elongated fingers pressed against its lips in a gesture demanding silence. Eleanor stopped so abruptly that Ethan nearly walked into her. "We shouldn't speak here," she whispered. Before anyone could ask why, the choir abruptly ceased. Absolute silence swallowed the ravine. Then another sound emerged. Children laughing. The laughter floated upward from somewhere beneath the bridge, light-hearted and playful, as though a group of children were chasing one another through a summer meadow rather than hiding in the depths of a frozen gorge. Deputy Collins cautiously aimed his flashlight over the crumbling stone railing. The beam disappeared into a sea of white mist, revealing nothing below. Yet the laughter continued, growing louder with each passing second. Curiosity overcame caution. Collins leaned farther over the edge. "Can anyone see?" His sentence stopped halfway. His entire body became rigid. Slowly, almost mechanically, he began climbing onto the bridge's stone railing. "Collins!" Sheriff Brooks shouted. The deputy did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on something hidden within the fog below. A peaceful smile spread across his face. "They're calling me," he murmured. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. Ethan lunged, grabbing the back of Collins's jacket just as his feet left the railing. Sheriff Brooks and another deputy rushed to help, pulling with all their strength as Collins fought against them with surprising force. He wasn't screaming or panicking. Instead, he struggled desperately to free himself, laughing softly like a child eager to join old friends. It took 3 grown men to drag him back onto the bridge. The moment his boots touched the stone again, the laughter stopped. Collins blinked several times, confused. "What happened?" he asked. He had no memory of climbing the railing. No memory of hearing children's voices. Only a strange feeling that he had almost forgotten something important. Shaken, the group hurried across the remainder of the bridge without another word. As Ethan reached the opposite side, something caught his attention. Scratched into the weathered stone beneath one of the silent statues were dozens of names. Hundreds, perhaps. Each accompanied by a date. The earliest entry had nearly faded away. 1748. The newest had been carved only months earlier. 2026, Harris family. Near the bottom of the stone, beneath all the others, a fresh line had appeared. The grooves looked as though they had been carved only moments ago. There was no dust. No weathering. Just clean cuts in ancient rock. Ethan shined his flashlight closer. His heartbeat slowed. The unfinished inscription read, 2026 Ethan Carter. The final letters were still being carved. Invisible claws scraped against solid stone. One slow stroke at a time. No one held the chisel. No hand touched the rock. Yet the mountain continued writing his name while the group watched in stunned silence. Then, from somewhere beyond the thick wall of fog ahead, they saw it. A faint golden light. Not moonlight. Not a lantern. The warm glow of stained glass windows shining through the trees. Hidden deep within the forgotten heart of Roan Mountain. The church was waiting. The warm light pouring through the church's stained glass windows seemed impossibly inviting against the endless darkness of Roan Mountain, but as Ethan Carter stepped through the weathered wooden doors, he realized the building was not abandoned at all. Every pew was occupied by silent figures dressed in clothing from different centuries, settlers, soldiers, children, hikers, and families who had vanished over the course of nearly 300 years. They all sat perfectly still with their heads bowed, as though waiting for a service that had never ended. At the far end of the sanctuary stood a tall figure cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood far darker than the night itself. It neither threatened nor welcomed them. Instead, it slowly raised one impossibly long hand and pointed toward an ancient stone altar. Resting upon it was a weathered leather book identical to the journal Eleanor had protected her entire life. When Ethan placed his journal beside it, the pages turned on their own, revealing a single unfinished sentence: "The burden ends only when it is willingly carried." In that moment, Ethan understood the terrible truth. The Walker had never been collecting innocent souls for pleasure. It was a guardian bound to an ancient curse, forced to choose one person in every generation to become the next keeper of the mountain's forgotten dead. Someone had to remember every lost name, every broken promise, every life that had disappeared into Roan Mountain, or the boundary between the living and the forgotten would collapse forever. Ethan looked back at Sheriff Brooks, Eleanor, the Harper family, and the frightened deputies who had risked everything to follow him into the impossible. He knew that if he walked away, the curse would simply continue. The footprints would return. Another family would be chosen. Another generation would vanish without explanation. Quietly, he stepped toward the altar and placed his hand upon the ancient journal. The church trembled as if awakening from centuries of silence. Outside, the massive three-toed footprints that surrounded the building began to fade one by one, disappearing into the snow. The shadowed figure lowered its hand and slowly dissolved into thousands of black feathers that scattered through the sanctuary before vanishing into the air. Around Ethan, the silent congregation finally lifted their heads. Their frightened expressions softened into peaceful smiles before their forms dissolved into streams of pale light that drifted upward through the broken roof and disappeared into the stars above Roan Mountain. One by one, the missing souls were finally released. When dawn broke over the Appalachian peaks, Sheriff Brooks, Eleanor Briggs, the Harper family, and the remaining deputies found themselves standing at the edge of Elk Hollow as though they had never entered the mountain at all. The ancient stone path, the hidden church, and every trace of the impossible had vanished with the night. Search teams later discovered Caleb's rifle, Thomas Harris's old jacket, and several rusted relics from people who had disappeared decades earlier, but Ethan Carter was nowhere to be found. The only evidence he had ever existed was a camera lying in fresh snow near the forest's edge. Its final recording showed nothing but an empty trail stretching into the mist before the image suddenly froze. Investigators dismissed it as a corrupted file. The people of Elk Hollow never spoke about it again. Yet every winter, after the first heavy snowfall blankets Roan Mountain, the oldest residents still wake before sunrise and quietly look toward the forest. Most mornings there is nothing but untouched white snow. But on rare occasions, a single line of enormous three-toed footprints emerges from the wilderness before disappearing back into the mountains. They no longer stop at anyone's home. They simply circle the edge of the town once, as if an unseen guardian is keeping watch. And if you ever decide to hike the lonely trails of Roan Mountain after a fresh snowfall, remember one warning the locals have passed down for generations: if you discover a trail of footprints with no beginning and no end, do not follow them. Because some legends are not meant to be solved. Some paths exist only to test whether you are willing to keep walking. And somewhere beyond the mist, where no map can lead, the keeper of the mountain is still watching, waiting for the day someone else hears the church bell ring.